So, since I'm about to advocate that everybody do something that I believe in very passionately, see, I don't. I'm not a big fan of forced arbitration agreements. I'm not at all of them and everything, and I am notedly critical of the fact that they are going to require you send them written notice in order to do this and everything and to go through this process, but I'm not particularly surprised that flexing your rights and insisting on your rights in this country is a difficult process that is a bit of a pain in the ass. It always has been. It seems like nothing ever really changes, like the more that things change, the more they stay the same, as they say in this country. But I looked through the agreement, which, if you see me copying pasting things in here, I'm going through the process of constructing what I'm going to put in the underbar to this video in of itself. So I went online, not really exactly knowing how to do this, but some contracts give you the right to opt out of a forced arbitration clause within a certain period of time, often 30 to 60 days after signing the agreement by notifying the company that you wish to opt out. And although I'm aware that most class action lawsuits don't actually lead to a situation where you get a big payout for the process, I know that, having considered all the potential security implications at this point of what they're talking about in this, that they will brick people's consoles, having considered all the potential ways that could go sideways, I am at the point where, I'm going to go through this, and if you do this, I would also recommend that you send it by certified mail. That way, they can't just sit there and say that they didn't receive it as a company. Because when you send legal notices and everything, it's pretty. I mean, you could just totally send it and stamp it and send it on, but if you do it that way, then you're gonna have problems where the company could just claim that they never received it in the first place. So you want, a receipt so that they can't say, if you do end up in court, they can't say that they didn't get it at all. And like I said, I mean, if they're doing packet injection, which, there's, understandably, I would be. I understand if you're skeptical that they're going to go down that route, but it's possible that that's how they construct the system. Can we agree on that? It's improbable, but it's possible. You know, and if that's the case, like I said, it could be potentially abused by and piggybacked on top of by abusive third parties. There's, if they build a backdoor into their systems to do this, the only thing that I can really see them doing to make this really work is to require that games, be able to connect to their Nintendo account services to actually be played. But there's an open question at that point of if the games that I play will do that, or if it will only be first party titles from Nintendo. So you know right here it says that you've got 30 days to opt out. You have the right to opt out of the arbitration requirements in section 16, and that's right down there in section J, of, and you look at the URL. It's, if it's actually in the video, but just the whole problem is it doesn't share my whole screen. But yeah, see, look, I'm looking at the whole Yulia here and everything, and I'm realizing that when it gets here, and when I, once I, have to, when I sign the agreements, when I get my Switch to, I'm gonna have to go through this whole process that's outlined here in Section J, which is to say that, it says that you have the right to opt out of the arbitration requirement in Section 16 by sending written notice of your decision to opt out to the following address within 30 days of the date in which you have first agreed to be bound by this agreement pursuant to its terms. Such notice must include the name of the person opting out, contact information for each person, and the email address that's registered to your Nintendo account. If you send timely written notice containing the required information and the arbitration requirement in this Section 16 will not apply to you or Nintendo, and the parties will settle any claims on an individual basis in accordance with Section 18. If you do not send such notice, then you agree to be bound. You agree to be bound by the arbitration requirement in this Section 16. So, anyways, looking at governing law venue. By the way, I live close to Washington, so this is, the agreement and all claims, including any claims that Nintendo that you has violated it that Nintendo has that you violated its intellectual property rights, will be subject to, governed, construed, interpreted in accordance with the laws of the state of Washington, USA, except for its conflict of law rules. Basically, if you opt out, you're now bound by Statute 18. Instead, all claims not subject to arbitration pursuant to Section 16 that cannot be heard in small claims court will be resolved exclusively in the state and federal courts located in King County, Washington, USA. You and Nintendo waive any objection to venue in the courts identified in Section 18. So I can certainly imagine a reality that of a situation as a resident of Oregon where I can gain representation in King County. Like I live in Washington County, Oregon, so but looking at this, I see this whole that you have to send it to the Washington office. I can't believe that they've got an office in Washington itself, but then again, they would not be the only company that is up there, in the Seattle area that's become internationally absolutely famous. And in retrospect, I can see why a Japanese company would have, host its services on the west coast of the United States, since, across the pond here in the west means something completely different than it does on the east coast. If you're a west coaster, across the pond at this point would actually why that term has become famous and everything, and usually people would expect it would mean England, but if we're being fair and accurate rather than insisting on the way that it's used colloquially in the United States, across the pond would thus refer to Tokyo rather than London, in the United States, and or at least the west coast of the United States. We are just geographically much, much closer to Japan at this point. And, knowing my own state, there's a local school in the area, right, that's of interest because the kids take courses in English for one half of the day and Japanese and the other. Yeah, it's totally true of the residents of the state. I mean, I feel so jealous of the kids that go there, but anyways, if you do the... So basically, if you don't agree to this, you're basically saying that your claims will be settled in the court, in King County, Washington, and everything, but I'm noted critic of such agreements at this point in the first place. I don't even like the 30-day opt-out right, requirements and everything. I think that this is a lot of bullshit that they're putting us through, that you have to go through all of this hassle in order to insist and fight for your rights, to your day in court on all of this. But, such... Again, like I said, I'm not really surprised as much, because this has become the norm in my country. It's become, standard for this kind of shit. Forced arbitration has been so effectively normalized in, my country that, Nintendo isn't even going to expect to get this letter from me. They're going to be quite surprised to even receive it at all. And they're going through this because they know that only a minority of us are going to actually do it. Unless somebody helps out, on the internet and does what I'm doing, which is to say that can any of us in this country really say that sending a letter by snail mail is really that hard to do in the United States? Like, is it really, really such a pain in the ass to do that you can't actually get it done? So, basically, I went and I found this PDF in particular, which I have no problem sharing with you and everything. And, essentially you can copy and paste, this section on the bottom here into, any application that you want and edit it. Like you put your address here, you put the date here, you replace all this with the, what Nintendo basically requires it to be, sent to. So, Nintendo. So I'm gonna go back to the agreement, here. So they're saying, the following address. Who are you? Like, attention on this though. So basically, I don't see anybody that that has to be. But what you would do here is, oh right, attention CS admin. I have no idea what's meant by CS. That makes me interested though. Attention legal. So I would put my address here, but like if I use today's date, I would do that. I would replace that way. I mean, those are just variables that you're gonna have to edit. You see what I'm doing? I'm going through the process of cutting and pasting the relevant information into where it's supposed to be, editing it together, so that it I'm gonna have to go back and edit this on the date, that I want, to do it later on. But all those places where it has that stuff, Nintendo. The arbitration requirement. You may reach me at the address above, so, and provide your email here, and then you sign it, and then you print your name, so you print this document out, and then you would sign it, but for me, since I do this my way, I would put this in LibreOffice myself and, go through that whole process. So, of sending of editing it in here so that it's properly formatted, basically. But that you can add all the flair so that it's pretty official and everything. And you're gonna have to go to the post office and send them a certified letter to do this. But I would advocate you do it. I mean, can you really? in summary, I would say the following: if there is a class action lawsuit against Nintendo that results from all of this, you're not likely to receive much money from the whole thing. But that's not really the point of class action lawsuits. Class action lawsuits are, because of the fact that there are so many claimants in them, the money has to be distributed by everybody that actually decides to take the claim. And so, once it's been sent between all the parties to the lawsuit, by the time that happens, you end up only having like a few pennies and everything for the whole thing. But once you distribute that across, the company basically ends up suffering a pretty big loss for this. But the truth of the matter is that these kinds of class action lawsuits have resulted in the furtherance of consumer rights all over the place in our country and everything, and have been ultimately for the good of the end consumer in a lot of cases. And so, it's just, it's not so much about getting a payday for me as it is, being able to teach Nintendo a lesson, if it does something that violates the rights of anybody, and to be able to be a party to that lawsuit in particular and everything. So I would I would advocate that you do so, because forced arbitration agreements are a bunch of bullshit. I mean, what I wish our country would outlaw them, because arbitration rarely actually protects your right, or is ever in the interest of the smaller party in the in the equation. It rarely ever favors our interest. It basically makes it a much bigger pain in the ass for you to collect on any damages that have been delivered to you as a consequence. And I'm quite certain that I'm now in the minority of people that go through this kind of hassle in the first place and rock the boat in this kind of way. But what do you want me to say? I'm actually standing up for myself fully at this point, and I'm going to go through the process here. And yes, I'm aware that pursuant to those terms, I don't necessarily I can't use that date. That date's gonna have to be adjusted when I actually send this. But I'm editing the document in the way that you would if you were going to send this letter to them, just to show you how you would get it done. To use this whole thing and everything based on the agreement that we have and everything. So you start replacing those variables in the document and everything, so that you can, and again, keeping in mind that this thing is not displaying my whole screen sometimes, but you would replace the variables. So if it says date and it puts it in those brackets, then you have to put the date there. That you have to put your email here. That you're going to have to print the document out and sign it and print your name in these areas when you send it to them and everything. And I'm going to put my Johnny Hancock all over that one, and send it on to them and everything to opt out of Section 16 of the Nintendo Yulia. And I'm sure they're not expecting this, but I because most people just sign it and go on with their lives and everything. And don't be that person. Don't do that. Stand up for yourself, fight for your rights, and let's don't be a pushover, basically.